What if I told you that the Roman Empire, the Soviet Union, and potentially modern Western economies all followed the exact same 7-stage pattern before their collapse? And what if I told you we're currently watching several of these stages unfold in real time? Here's the paradox that should terrify every economist and citizen. Throughout history, no civilization has ever seen their own collapse coming. The Romans thought they were eternal. The Soviets believed their system was scientifically inevitable. The British were certain the sun would never set on their empire. Yet each one followed an almost identical pathway to dissolution, a pattern so consistent it suggests something fundamental about how complex economic systems fail. The question isn't whether this pattern exists. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, are we smart enough to recognize it while we're living through it? Welcome back to the Economic Philosopher, where we explore the deep currents that shape our economic reality. You've just heard the hook, and I know what you're thinking. Another doom and gloom prediction about economic collapse, another person claiming the sky is falling. But here's what makes this different. We're not going to talk about opinions or predictions. We're going to examine empirical patterns that have repeated across thousands of years, multiple continents, and radically different political systems. The problem we face today is that modern economics largely ignores history. We treat our current system as unprecedented, our challenges as unique, our solutions as innovative. But the Romans had quantitative easing. They called it coin clipping. The medieval kingdoms had their version of deficit spending. The Spanish Empire experienced what we'd now call currency collapse after flooding their economy with New World silver. What I'm going to show you today is a framework, a 7-stage pattern that appears with remarkable consistency before major economic and political collapses. This isn't mysticism or prophecy. This is pattern recognition applied to historical data. And more importantly, I'm going to show you where we are in this pattern right now and what history suggests happens next. By the end of this video, you'll understand why empires don't collapse overnight, why the warning signs are always visible in retrospect, and why the very mechanisms societies use to prevent collapse often accelerate it. You'll see how philosophy, psychology, and economics interweave to create these grand historical patterns. This is the Economic Philosopher. Let's decode the pattern of collapse. Let's start with a fundamental insight from the philosopher George Santayana, who famously observed that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But there's a deeper truth here. We don't just forget the past, we actively convince ourselves that this time is different. When you examine the collapse of major civilizations from ancient Rome to the Ming Dynasty, from the Ottoman Empire to the Soviet Union, consistent pattern emerges. It's not that history repeats exactly, but, as Mark Twain allegedly noted, it certainly rhymes. The 7 stages are, first, fiscal overextension and imperial overreach. Second, currency debasement and monetary manipulation. Third, wealth concentration and social fragmentation. Fourth, declining faith in institutions. Fifth, increased internal conflict and political polarization. Sixth, desperate reform attempts that often backfire. And seventh, cascading system failure and dissolution. What's remarkable isn't just that these stages appear, but that they appear in roughly this order, and they feed into each other in predictable ways. Let's examine Rome in detail, because it's the collapse Western civilization has studied most extensively. In the 2nd century AD, Rome appeared invincible. The Pax Romana brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. Trade flourished from Britain to Persia. Roman citizenship was expanding. The empire had never seemed stronger. But beneath the surface, stage 1 was already underway. The empire had grown too large to defend efficiently. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign fighting wars on multiple fronts: the Marcomannic Wars, conflicts with Parthia. The military budget was consuming an ever larger share of imperial revenue. By the 3rd century, stage 2 had arrived with a vengeance. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 50 emperors, most assassinated or killed in battle. To pay the military, the only institution maintaining order, emperors systematically debased the currency. The silver content of the denarius fell from 90% to less than 5% in just a few decades. This wasn't ignorance. Emperors understood they were destroying the currency, but they faced an impossible choice: debase the currency or face immediate military collapse. The economic historian Peter Temin has documented how this triggered severe inflation, A measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in the 2nd century cost over 200,000 denarii by the early 4th century. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a crisis of trust that leads us directly into stage 3. As currency became worthless, wealth concentrated among those who owned real assets. Land, primarily, the middle class of small farmers and urban craftsmen, was destroyed. Society split into ultra-wealthy landowners and dependent peasants. The tax base collapsed, just as government expenses soared. Fast forward 1,500 years. The Soviet Union in the 1970s seemed like a permanent feature of the global order. It had survived World War II, built a nuclear arsenal, launched satellites, and created a superpower rivalry that defined an era. But stage 1 was evident to careful observers. The USSR was maintaining a military establishment it couldn't afford, supporting allied regimes across 3 continents and fighting an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. The economist Yegor Gaidar, who would later help manage the Soviet collapse, calculated that by the 1980s, military and related expenses consumed over 40% of Soviet GDP. Stage 2 manifested differently, but followed the same logic. Unable to debase currency that was already non-convertible, the Soviets instead borrowed heavily abroad and used their oil exports to subsidize domestic consumption. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the system had no shock absorbers. Stages 3 and 4 arrived almost simultaneously. The nomenklatura, the party elite, had always enjoyed privileges. But by the 1980s, the gap between official ideology and lived reality became impossible to ignore. Store shelves were empty for ordinary citizens, while party officials shopped in special stores. The philosopher Alexander Zinoviev observed that everyone in the Soviet Union knew the system was based on lies, and everyone knew that everyone else knew, yet the collective pretense continued. Until it didn't. Stage 4, the collapse of institutional legitimacy, happened with shocking speed. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms intended to save the system instead revealed how hollow it had become. When the government admitted to past crimes and allowed criticism, people realized the emperor truly had no clothes. Britain's imperial decline offers another variation. After World War I, Britain faced stage 1 an empire too expensive to maintain. The war had cost Britain 25% of its national wealth. But Britain still tried to act like a global hegemon, maintaining military bases worldwide and a naval fleet larger than any rival. Stage 2 came in the form of monetary decisions. Britain returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate, a decision John Maynard Keynes warned would prove disastrous. The overvalued pound made British exports uncompetitive, triggering deflation and unemployment. When World War II arrived, Britain had to liquidate overseas assets and borrow heavily from the United States. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked stage 4 at the moment when institutional authority collapsed. Britain and France invaded Egypt to maintain control over the Suez Canal. The United States forced them to withdraw by threatening to crash the pound. Overnight, the world saw that Britain was no longer a great power. It was a debtor nation dependent on American support. What links these seemingly different collapses? The philosopher of history, Arnold Toynbee, identified what he called the principle of challenge and response. Civilizations rise by successfully responding to challenges. They fall when their responses become mechanical, when they keep applying old solutions to new problems. The economic manifestation of this is what we might call institutional sclerosis. The economist Moncure Olson described how successful societies accumulate special interest groups, guilds, unions, corporations, lobbies, each with a stake in the status quo. Over time, these groups gain enough power to block reforms that would benefit society as a whole but harm their specific interests. This is the challenge we face. We can see the pattern. We understand the dynamics. We know where this is heading. But do we have the collective capacity to do anything about it? Let me synthesize what we've covered and translate it into something actionable, because understanding without action is just sophisticated pessimism. The 7-stage collapse pattern isn't deterministic, it's probabilistic. Societies that overextend, manipulate currency, concentrate wealth, lose institutional legitimacy, polarize politically, attempt desperate reforms, and experience cascading failures don't always collapse, but they always face severe disruption and frequently collapse. What history teaches is this: Stage 1 through Stage 3 can persist for generations. Rome was overextended for centuries, but once Stage 4 begins, one's institutional legitimacy erodes, the timeline compresses dramatically. The Soviet Union went from apparent permanence to dissolution in less than a decade. The British Empire's endgame played out over roughly 15 years from World War II's end to Suez. We're somewhere between Stage 4 and Stage 5. Institutional legitimacy has clearly eroded. Internal conflict is rising. Reform attempts are beginning, but remain inadequate to the scale of challenges. First, understand that normalcy bias is your enemy. The single most dangerous assumption is that because things have been stable, they'll remain stable. History screams otherwise. Every collapsing civilization believed itself exceptional until it wasn't. Second, recognize that individual action matters, but systemic action matters more. You can protect yourself through financial diversification, skill development, community building, and geographic optionality. These are prudent regardless. But individual preparation doesn't prevent collective collapse, just helps you weather it. Third, understand the timeline. If the historical pattern holds, we're looking at a decade to 3 decades of increasing instability. Not tomorrow's apocalypse, but not business as usual for your career either. This suggests medium-term planning over both short-term panic and long-term complacency. Fourth, watch for cascade triggers. The pattern suggests collapse accelerates suddenly after long stability. Key indicators: sovereign debt crises, currency crises, major war, breakdown of international institutions, food or energy shocks. When multiple crises hit simultaneously, that's your signal that Stage 7 is beginning. Fifth, invest in antifragile systems and skills. Nassim Taleb's concept is crucial here. What benefits from disorder? Practical skills, real assets, strong communities, adaptability, multiple income streams, location flexibility. What's destroyed by disorder? Complex financial products, long supply chains, specialized credentials that become obsolete, dependence on specific institutions. Remember our opening paradox: why can't civilizations see their own collapse? Now you understand the answer is philosophically, success creates the conditions for failure, and recognizing this requires accepting the fundamental limits we spend our rise denying. Psychologically, we're cognitively and emotionally poorly equipped to recognize gradual systemic threats, especially when acknowledging them would require abandoning status quo bias and system justification. Economically, the very mechanisms we use to stave off collapse currency, manipulation, debt accumulation, reform, attempts often accelerate it by creating new problems while leaving root causes unaddressed. But here's the reframe. Maybe the question isn't whether we can prevent collapse, but whether we can navigate it with less suffering than previous civilizations. Rome's fall led to centuries of dark ages. The Soviet collapse caused severe hardship, but not civilizational extinction. Britain's imperial decline was managed relatively peacefully. The pattern suggests that how you enter collapse shapes what comes after. Societies that maintain some institutional legitimacy, preserve knowledge and infrastructure, and avoid total political polarization emerge faster and stronger. This means the action item isn't prevent collapse that may be beyond our capacity. It's reduce the severity and duration of disruption that's actually achievable through reform, adaptation, and accepting necessary limits before they're catastrophically imposed. Here's the paradox that should give us hope. We are the first civilization with full knowledge of the collapse pattern while living through it. That's unprecedented. Every tool of economics, philosophy, psychology, and history is at our disposal in a way no previous society possessed. The question is whether knowledge translates to wisdom, and whether wisdom translates to action. That remains to be determined. But awareness is the prerequisite for everything else. The philosopher William James said that compared to what we ought to be, we are only half awake. Most of history sleepwalks into disaster. We have the chance to walk into it with eyes open and, perhaps just perhaps, to walk a different path entirely. If this analysis resonates with you, I need you to do 3 things. First, share this video. Not because I need the algorithm boost, though that helps, but because this conversation needs to happen broadly. The pattern works partly through collective ignorance. Breaking that ignorance is itself a form of resistance. Second, Tell me in the comments, where do you think we are in the 7-stage pattern? Do you see us at stage 4, stage 5, somewhere in between? What indicators are you watching? What are you doing to prepare? Let's build collective intelligence in the comments. Third, if you want to go deeper into these topics, the intersection of economics, philosophy, history, and psychologies, subscribe to the Economic Philosopher. Hit the notification bell because YouTube's algorithm is fickle, and we're covering topics the algorithm doesn't always love. I've got upcoming videos on the philosophy of money, the psychology of economic decision-making, and historical patterns in technological disruption. If you found value here, you'll find value there. Remember, understanding these patterns doesn't guarantee we'll avoid them, but it's the only chance we have. Be informed, be thoughtful, be prepared. This has been the Economic Philosopher. Thank you for thinking deeply about these patterns with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay vigilant. This approach is late Roman levels. The historian Kyle Harper has shown that by the 4th century AD, wealth concentration in Rome had reached such extremes that the economy essentially bifurcated luxury goods, market for the elite, and subsistence for everyone else. But it's not just America. The economist Thomas Piketty documented in Capital in the 21st century that inequality has been rising across most developed economies since the 1980s. His central thesis that returns on capital exceed economic growth rates. Causing wealth to concentrate is essentially a mathematical description of stage 3 dynamics. The psychological and social consequences match historical patterns. Trust in institutions has declined dramatically across developed nations. The political scientists Roberto Stefan Foa and Yasha Mounk have documented what they call democratic deconsolidation. Younger generations are significantly less committed to democratic norms than their parents. Social mobility, the possibility of rising from poverty to prosperity, has declined substantially. The economist Raj Chetty's research shows that someone born in 1940 had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents. For someone born in 1980, it's 50% a coin flip. This creates precisely the social fragmentation visible in previous collapses. Society splits into groups with radically different lived experiences and no shared narrative or trust. This brings us to stage 4, which may be the most advanced stage in our current situation. Trust in virtually every major institution has declined precipitously. According to Gallup polling, confidence in Congress has fallen from 42% in 1973 to just 21% recently. Confidence in the Supreme Court dropped from 45% to just 25%. Media confidence has plummeted from 72% to just 34%. This isn't partisan, it affects institutions across the political spectrum. The decline is remarkably consistent across different surveys and methodologies. Something fundamental has broken in the relationship between citizens and institutions. The political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who once proclaimed the end of history, has more recently written about the decay of American political institutions. He argues that the system has been captured by special interests and has lost its ability to address major challenges. International institutions face similar crises. The World Trade Organization is increasingly irrelevant as countries resort to bilateral deals and trade wars. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed by great power rivalry. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank face challenges to their legitimacy from newly empowered developing nations. Even scientific institutions aren't immune. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed deep public skepticism toward scientific authorities, a skepticism that had been building for decades but became undeniable during the crisis. This is classic stage 4. Institutions haven't yet collapsed, but their authority has been hollowed out. They maintain the form of legitimacy while losing its substance. Stage 5 increased internal conflict, and polarization is now glaringly obvious across multiple societies. American politics has become more polarized than at any point since the Civil War. The political scientists Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal developed a measure called DW-Nominate that tracks ideological positions of members of Congress. Their data shows the parties have never been further apart in the modern era. Moreover, partisan effect how much members of one party dislike the other party has grown dramatically. But polarization isn't just American. Brazil nearly tore itself apart over recent elections. The United Kingdom fractured over Brexit. France faces sustained yellow vest protests and deep urban-rural divides. Germany sees the rise of parties on both far left and far right. India experiences increased Hindu-Muslim tensions. China faces separatist movements and regional tensions it hasn't seen in decades. The pattern matches historical precedents eerily well. Late Rome saw barbarian generals fighting each other for imperial control while provinces rebelled. The Soviet Union's final years featured ethnic conflicts across its republics. The British Empire faced nationalist movements and strikes across its territory. The economist Albert Hirschman described this as the breakdown of exit, voice, and loyalty. In healthy systems, dissatisfied members can exit, use voice to reform, or remain loyal while working for change. In late-stage systems, exit becomes impossible, voice is ineffective, and loyalty feels like complicity. We're beginning to see Stage 6 desperate reform attempts that often backfire. This is perhaps the most tragic phase, because it involves genuine efforts to address problems that nonetheless accelerate collapse. Consider the 2008 financial crisis response. Governments intervened to prevent systemic collapse, arguably the right decision in the moment. But the way they did it, bailing out financial institutions while ordinary homeowners lost everything, reinforced Stage 3 inequality and Stage 4 legitimacy decline. The reforms themselves often work at cross purposes. Efforts to address climate change conflict with economic growth imperatives, attempts to reduce inequality conflict with efficiency and innovation, policies to restore manufacturing conflict with service economy realities. This mirrors previous collapse patterns perfectly. Roman Emperor Diocletian's reforms, price controls, currency reform, administrative reorganization were thoughtful attempts to address systemic problems, but they ultimately accelerated economic dysfunction and political fragmentation. His successor Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople, effectively abandoning the Western Empire. Soviet perestroika and glasnost under Gorbachev were genuine attempts at reform, but they revealed how rotten the system had become, triggering collapse rather than renewal. The challenge is what economists call the Lucas critique. When you change policy, people change their behavior in response, often undermining the policy's intent. Reforms designed for one situation create new problems that require new reforms in an accelerating cycle. We haven't reached Stage 7 cascading system failure yet, but we can see potential triggers. A major war between great powers would almost certainly trigger it. China-Taiwan conflict, Russia-NATO escalation, Iran-Israel confrontation, any of these could cascade into broader conflict that collapses the international system. A major pandemic worse than COVID-19 could do it. Climate change accelerating beyond tipping points could do it. A financial crisis worse than 2008, perhaps triggered by debt levels that are now far higher. A cyber attack that takes down critical infrastructure. Even something as prosaic as a critical commodity, shortage food, energy, rare earth metals. The key insight from history is that Stage 7 is rarely triggered by the obvious threat everyone's worried about. Rome didn't fall to Persian invasion or Germanic tribes, those were symptoms, not causes. The Soviet Union didn't collapse from Western military pressure, that was Reagan's mythology. Britain didn't lose its empire to a specific military defeat, it lost it to economic exhaustion. Stage 7 happens when multiple stresses hit simultaneously and institutions lack the capacity to respond. It's death by 1,000 cuts, not one dramatic blow. But here's where our situation differs from every previous collapse. We know the pattern. No previous civilization had access to comparative historical analysis. The Romans couldn't study the fall of previous empires because they didn't have the historical records or analytical frameworks. The Soviets had Marxist historical materialism, but it blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. We have something unprecedented, the ability to recognize the pattern while we're in it. The question is whether knowledge is sufficient to change outcomes. The economist and complexity theorist Brian Arthur argues that modern economies are complex adaptive systems. They evolve and learn, but they also get locked into path dependencies. Once you're on a particular trajectory, changing course becomes exponentially harder. The Soviet nomenclatura developed what Russian sociologists call a parallel society, special hospitals, special schools, special stores, special vacation resorts. They literally lived in a different world than ordinary citizens. Contemporary research on wealth and empathy shows similar patterns. Studies by psychologist Paul Piff found that higher social class predicts increased unethical behavior and decreased empathy. Wealthier individuals are more likely to break traffic laws, take candy from children, lie in negotiations, cheat in games, and endorse unethical behavior at work. This creates a vicious cycle in Stage 3 collapses. As inequality grows, elites become more cognitively and emotionally detached from the majority. This makes them less capable of recognizing the severity of social problems. Their proposed solutions become increasingly disconnected from reality. This further erodes institutional legitimacy, accelerating the collapse cycle. The psychologist Martin Seligman discovered learned helplessness in experiments with dogs. When animals are subjected to negative stimuli, they can't escape. They eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. They've learned that effort is futile. This same dynamic appears in collapsing societies. When institutions fail repeatedly, when reforms never seem to change anything, when corruption appears systemic and ineradicable, populations develop collective learned helplessness, political participation declines, social trust erodes, people retreat into private life and small networks of family and friends. The sociologist Robert Putnam documented this in Bowling Alone, showing the collapse of civic engagement in America over recent decades. People still bowl, but they bowl alone rather than in leagues. This seemingly trivial change reflects something profound, the breakdown of the social capital that holds communities together. In collapsing empires, this manifests as what ancient Romans called anomia, breakdown of social bonds and norms. The sociologist Emil Durkheim studied this phenomenon, showing how anomia increases during periods of rapid change, whether positive or negative. When people can't predict how society will respond to their actions, they become untethered, anxious, and prone to extremism. Perhaps most importantly, we need to understand how humans respond psychologically to slow-moving crises versus acute ones. Psychologist Daniel Gilbert has shown that humans are excellent at responding to immediate, visible threats, but terrible at responding to gradual, invisible ones. We'll leap away from a snake, but ignore rising carbon dioxide levels. We'll flee a burning building, but not address the gradual erosion of democratic norms. This is partly neurological. Our amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, evolved to identify immediate physical dangers. It doesn't activate strongly for statistical risks, long-term trends, or systemic problems. This is why collapse patterns are so hard to recognize while living through them. Each individual change seems small, manageable, normal. It's only in retrospect that we see them as part of a pattern. The psychologist Robert Ornstein called this the boiled frog syndrome. Though the actual experiment has been debunked, the metaphor remains useful. Gradual changes in temperature don't trigger escape responses the way sudden changes do. For collapsing societies, this means the very gradualism that makes collapse patterns so consistent also makes them nearly invisible to people experiencing them. Each stage flows into the next so smoothly that there's never an obvious moment to say, this is where we need to radically change course. Finally, we need to understand status quo bias and system justification theory. The psychologist John Jost has shown that humans have a deep psychological need to believe that existing systems are legitimate, fair, and even inevitable even when those systems harm them. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of collapse, why ordinary people often support policies that accelerate their own impoverishment. The political scientist Thomas Frank explored this in What's the Matter with Kansas, showing how working-class Americans often vote against their economic interests. System justification theory suggests this isn't irrationality, it's a psychological coping mechanism. When you're trapped in a system, you can't escape. It's less psychologically painful to believe the system is just than to believe you're being exploited. The cognitive dissonance of knowing you're in an unjust system you're powerless to change is unbearable. This means that in Stage 4, collapses declining faith in institutions, there's a strange paradox, even as trust erodes. People cling to familiar systems because the alternative, accepting that everything is fundamentally broken, is to psychologically destabilizing. This takes us into the economic mechanisms that transform these psychological and philosophical patterns into material collapse. Now we arrive at the crucial question: where are we in the 7-stage pattern, and what does history suggest happens next? Let's start with uncomfortable facts. The United States maintains approximately 750 military installations in over 80 countries. Annual military spending exceeds $800 billion more than the next 10 countries combined. Add veterans benefits, intelligence agencies, and interest on debt from past wars, and the true cost approaches $1.5 trillion annually. This is textbook stage 1. Like Rome spreading legions across 3 continents. Like Britain maintaining global naval dominance, it could no longer afford. America maintains a military footprint incommensurate with its economic base. The economist Niall Ferguson has called this imperial overstretch, the historian Paul Kennedy's term for when a great power's strategic commitments exceed its economic capacity to support them. Kennedy documented how this pattern preceded the decline of Habsburg Spain, Napoleonic France, and the British Empire. China faces its own version. The Belt and Road Initiative has committed over $1 trillion to infrastructure projects across 60 countries. Many of these projects are economically questionable, sustained more by geopolitical ambition than sound investment logic. This is eerily similar to Soviet-era spending to maintain client-state spending that appeared sustainable until suddenly it wasn't. The European Union, meanwhile, struggles with a different overextension, political rather than military. It has expanded to 27 members with wildly different economic situations, creating stresses the monetary union was never designed to handle. Now consider stage 2. Since 2008, we've witnessed monetary experiments unprecedented in scale. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England all deployed similar policies: quantitative easing, negative interest rates, massive asset purchases. This isn't exactly like Roman coin clipping, but the underlying logic is identical. Authorities manipulate currency to solve problems they can't or won't address through real economic reform. The economist Mohamed Illyrian calls this the only game in town. Central banks have become the primary economic policymakers because political systems are too dysfunctional to pass meaningful fiscal reforms. But here's the critical insight from history. Monetary manipulation always works. Until suddenly, it doesn't. Roman coin clipping sustained the empire for decades before triggering hyperinflation. The Soviet Union's borrowing sustained consumption for years before the 1980s oil crash revealed its insolvency. Weimar Germany's money printing solved immediate post-war problems before destroying the currency. The question isn't whether current monetary policies are sustainable long-term. They're not. The question is how long they remain sustainable and what triggers the break. Cryptocurrencies add a fascinating wrinkle. Some proponents see them as escape from fiat currency manipulation. But history suggests new money forms don't prevent collapse. They're often symptoms of it. Private currencies proliferated in the late Roman Empire as state currency lost credibility. Soviet citizens increasingly used dollars and goods for real transactions, while rubles became accounting fictions. Now we hit stage 3, where the data becomes truly alarming. According to research by economists Emmanuel Sees and Gabriel Zuckman, the wealth share of the top 0.1% in the United States has grown from 7% in 1979 to about 20% today. The bottom 50% of Americans own essentially zero net wealth. This creates a trap. The very success of a civilization creates the conditions for its stagnation and eventual collapse. Rome's military success led to overextension. The Soviet Union's industrial buildup created rigid bureaucracies, resistant to change. Britain's financial dominance made it unwilling to adjust to its declining industrial competitiveness. Now we need to understand why this pattern repeats. If collapse follows such a predictable path, why doesn't any civilization simply avoid it? This is where philosophy provides crucial insights. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel proposed that history moves through a dialectical process: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Each historical stage contains the seeds of its own negation. Success creates the conditions for failure. Applied to empires, this means the qualities that make a society successful in rising become liabilities in maturity. Rome's military culture, perfect for conquest, became a burden when there were no more lands worth conquering. The Soviet Union's centralized planning, effective for rapid industrialization, proved disastrous for managing a complex modern economy. American capitalism's emphasis on short-term profits, effective at generating wealth, struggles with long-term challenges like infrastructure and climate change. The philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls this anti-fragility. Systems can be fragile, robust, or antifragile. Fragile systems break under stress. Robust systems resist stress. Antifragile systems actually benefit from moderate stress. The problem with empires is they tend to become fragile over time, even as they appear robust. Why? Because success allows them to stop adapting. Adaptation requires stress, failure, experimentation. But established empires suppress these things. They create regulations to prevent disruption. They bail out failing institutions because they're too big to fail. They prioritize stability over evolution. Every collapsing civilization suffers from what we might call the inevitability delusion. They believe their system is not just successful, but inevitable, permanent, perhaps even scientifically ordained. The Romans believed they had discovered the formula for eternal civilization. Virgil's Aeneid promised them imperium sine, fine empire without end. This wasn't poetic license. Romans genuinely believed their system was qualitatively different from every other civilization in history. Soviet leaders believed dialectical materialism proved their system's scientific inevitability. Nikita Khrushchev famously told Western diplomats in 1956 that their grandchildren would live under communism. This wasn't blustered, it was sincere conviction based on what they saw as historical science. Francis Fukuyama captured this same mentality in his famous essay about the end of history after the Cold War. Western liberal democracy, he argued, represented the final form of human government. History had reached its destination. The philosopher Karl Popper warned against what he called historicism, the belief that history follows inevitable laws that we can discover and predict. Popper argued this was not just wrong, but dangerous. It leads societies to believe they're riding historical waves they cannot control, absolving them of responsibility for their choices. But there's a deeper psychological explanation. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman has documented dozens of cognitive biases that distort individual thinking. These same biases affect collective decision-making, but at a civilizational scale, they become catastrophic. Consider normalcy bias, the tendency to assume that because something hasn't happened, it won't happen. Romans in the 5th century had lived their entire lives in a Roman world. The empire was 800 years old. Collapse was literally unimaginable. When it happened, they described it using religious language, the end times, divine judgment, because they had no framework for understanding it as a natural historical process. Or consider sunk cost, fallacy continuing an endeavor because of previously invested resources, even when those costs are unrecoverable. The British Empire in the 1940s and 50s was the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. Generations had invested blood, treasure, and identity into the empire. Abandoning it felt like betraying everything their ancestors had built, even though maintaining it was bankrupting the nation. Loss aversion explains why reforms come too late. The psychologist Kahneman found that losses loom about twice as large as equivalent gains. When a civilization faces decline, the certain pain of reform outweighs the uncertain benefit of averting collapse. It's always easier to delay painful decisions and hope something will change. At the deepest level, collapse stems from refusing to accept limits. The ancient Greek concept of hubris captures this, the arrogant overstepping of proper bounds that precedes nemesis, or downfall. Every empire eventually faces the same choice: accept limits or collapse, trying to transcend them. Accept that you can't defend every border, or bankrupt yourself trying. Accept that you can't manipulate your currency infinitely, or destroy your monetary system. Accept that inequality can't grow forever, or face revolution. The philosopher Albert Camus explored this in The Myth of Sisyphus. He argued that the fundamental philosophical question is whether to accept the absurd limitations of existence or rebel against them. Empires, in their maturity, always choose rebellion. They refuse to accept that they, like every other civilization in history, have limits. This connects to what the economist Kenneth Boulding called the cowboy economy versus the spaceship economy. The cowboy economy assumes infinite resources and infinite frontiers. There's always new land to exploit. The spaceship economy recognizes that resources are finite and must be managed sustainably. Empires in decline are cowboy economies that have run out of frontier. Rather than adapt to limits, they deploy increasingly desperate measures to maintain the illusion of limitlessness. This takes us directly into the psychological dynamics of Stage 3. Now, we need to understand the psychological mechanisms that prevent individuals and societies from recognizing collapse patterns, even when they're obvious in retrospect. The economist Timur Kuran developed a theory called preference falsification, the act of misrepresenting one's genuine wants under perceived social pressures. In collapsing societies, this becomes epidemic. Consider the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The economist Gregory Yavinsky later revealed that by 1989, virtually no one in the Soviet leadership actually believed in communist ideology anymore. But everyone pretended they did because everyone thought everyone else did. The entire system was sustained by collective pretense. This creates what Kuran calls preference cascades, rapid shifts in public opinion when preference falsification breaks down. For decades, everyone pretends to believe. Then one person admits doubt, then another. Suddenly, the collective illusion shatters, and everyone admits what they privately knew all along. The psychological cost of this is immense. The psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton studied what he called ideological totalism, the psychological state of living in a system where you must constantly pretend to believe things you know are false. It creates cognitive dissonance, anxiety, cynicism. In collapsing empires, this manifests as a peculiar combination of public confidence and private despair. Official discourse remains optimistic, while private conversations are deeply pessimistic. Trust erodes not just in institutions, but in the possibility of honest communication itself. One of the most important psychological dynamics in collapse is what political scientists call elite capture, when the ruling class becomes increasingly disconnected from the broader society and serves primarily its own interests. The psychologist Dr. Keltner has researched how power affects cognition. His studies show that powerful people literally become less capable of empathy, less able to take others' perspectives, and more likely to violate social norms. Power doesn't just corrupt, morally it corrupts cognitively. In the late Roman Empire, senatorial families lived in vast estates with private armies while the urban poor survived on grain dole. The disconnect was total. The elite genuinely couldn't understand why the masses weren't content with bread and circuses.